Oh boy, it is that time again where I finally get to do another movie review on how historically accurate it is. And this one, I'm not gonna lie, I am very excited for. Because this particular movie review is something that I have been wanting to get into for quite a long while. Though I believe what I should have said was series of movie reviews because I'm going to be touching on the Bayani verse, a series of Filipino historical films that focuses on my country's national heroes. With the first movie of the Bayaniverse focusing on one of the greatest generals of the country, General Antonio Luna. Fair warning, I am going to be pronouncing the word general in the Tagalog or Spanish way, which is general, mostly because it feels natural to me when I'm talking about Luna. Appointed as the Chief of War Operations by President Emilio Aguinaldo, Brigadier General Antonio Luna finds himself leading a newly formed Philippine Republican Army against the world's new emerging superpower, the United States of America. Driven by its so-called manifest destiny and interest in obtaining natural resources from the Caribbean, the United States government sought to expand its colonial outreach much further towards the Pacific. Despite them concluding the Mexican-American War a few decades before, American and capitalist interests won out. Soon after, America would be at war with Spain, which started after the sinking of the USS Maine. The armored cruiser was sent to Havana to ensure the safety of American citizens in Cuba, and under the narrative that the Americans were to liberate the natives from their Spanish colonial overlords. This not only targeted the Spaniards' holdings within the Americas, but also their other colony in Southeast Asia. For over 330 years, the Philippines remained under the authority of the Spanish crown. But through several years, groups of enlightened and educated Filipinos slowly spread the idea of nationalism. Most influential among them was a well-educated man named Dr. Jose Rizal, the country's most influential national hero. But Jose Rizal's work wasn't the only thing that led to the spread of the ideas of breaking the chains of colonialism. From the shadows, a secret society was formed. Its main objective was to fight for the country's freedom from its colonial overlords through a violent uprising. The secret society is known as the Katipunan, founded by Andres Bonifacio, primarily composed of working-class people who've grown tired of Spanish rule. Their armed struggle against the Spaniards was a bloody one, and saw more losses than victories. Now, as much as I wish to go through both of these topics, that will unfortunately have to wait for a video on a possibly separate movie review or a bunch more separate videos entirely. But I want to touch on what made Rizal such an influential figure in my country's history, and it was the founding of both La Solidaridad and La Liga Filipina. These two organized groups were responsible for the propaganda movement that promoted reforms that pushed for legal equality for Filipinos. Another influential work was Rizal's two novels, Noli Me Tangere and its sequel, El Filibusterismo. The writings of both novels reflected the living conditions of oppression and helped understand the corruption that Filipinos faced under the Spaniards. Again, I really wish I could go through into detail about all of this here on this particular video, including the history of the Katipunan, but we must save this for another time. In the aftermath of the Spanish-American War and the signing of the Treaty of Paris on December 10th, 1898, the Philippines would secretly be bought by the Americans in a backdoor agreement between them and the Spaniards, which finally leads us to the movie proper. Obvious question here, does the movie accurately and authentically portray Heneral Luna and the events of the Philippine-American War well? Well, everyone, Let's start off our journey in the Bayaniverse with Gerald Talog's Heneral Luna.
Isang direksyon lang pag-uutok! Huwag aaksihin ng bala! Huwag!
After the movie's opening crawl of text that briefly explains the historical background of the film, we're immediately introduced to the main protagonist of the movie's story, General Antonio Luna, along with a prospecting journalist, Joven. Now, to get this out of the way, the character Joven is a fictional character, so the interactions he has with Luna and other figures are also fictional. He is meant to act as the audience's eyes and ears as history unfolds before them. Added the fact that the character is a journalist, he acts as a unique narrator for us viewers. It also acts as the movie's reason for the story being fictionalized or overly dramatized, with the movie unfolding as Joven's own narrative and retellings, basically. Even if the interaction between Joven and Luna is fictional, there are some elements of historical facts sprinkled in. One of which was mentioned in the beginning was Antonio Luna's brother, Juan Luna, being credited as the artist behind the designs of the Philippine Army uniforms.
Si Juan, yung kapatid ko nag-isip ng tabas. Ako mismo ang nagbayad nito.
Which he commissioned himself from his brother. We will touch on Juan Luna's story and artistic contributions later on in this video. The uniform itself was made out of rayadillo or striped material in English. The color of the uniforms was usually light blue, while surviving examples of uniform jackets and trousers from the 1890s have thinner stripes of a much darker blue, basically. And brass buttons were either adorned or decorated with a mythical sun motif. The uniform itself would officially be instituted to become the Republic's standard uniform during the Teodoro Convention on March 22, 1897. Juan Luna was also credited with the designing of the collar insignia for the uniforms, distinguishing among the services of infantry, cavalry, artillery, sappers, and medical personnel. After the short interaction, we jump forward to a cabinet meeting held by the First Republic's government in the province of Bulacan, led by President Emilio Aguinaldo, as well as Apolinario Mabini as the Prime Minister. Now, Mabini by this point had suffered from the effects of polio, which he contracted all the way back in 1895. I'm mentioning this now because every time we see Mabini in the movie, he's always sitting down. And by the years 1898 to 1899, he had been completely paralyzed on both legs for like 4 years by this point. Despite his disability, however, he was still able to prove his worth by being the chief advisor to Aguinaldo and was responsible for drafting the first Philippine Republic's constitution. The cabinet meeting in this scene shows its members, who are a part of the elite class in Philippine society, debating whether they can trust the Americans or not. And as the fading text explains, a lot of them believed that the presence of the American forces was of good intentions, which was to help liberate the country.
Kaaway din ng Espanya ang Amerika. Ang kaaway ng aking mga kaaway, tuturing kong kaibigan.
Un maricon.
Now, the film doesn't really specify a date, but from what I could understand from the dialogue being said, and from the later news Aguinaldo received that Manila was taken by the Americans much later on in the meeting, this particular meeting would be set around August 13th, 1898. Now, this is where it gets interesting. A lot of you might be picturing an epic battle between the world's new emerging global superpower against one of its oldest and now fading. But that really was not the case. In reality, just a month prior in July, both American and Spanish commanders negotiated a secret agreement to stage a fake battle in Manila, after which Spanish forces would surrender to the United States forces with the additional condition that the Filipinos weren't allowed to enter the city. In turn, this would be labeled historically as the Mock Battle of Manila. The question is, why did both sides go to such lengths? To help explain, from late May to late June 1898, the Filipino revolutionaries began to gain crucial ground with the support of the Americans. The most significant being the Battle of Alpan on May 28, 1898. Soon after, by late June to early July, the full might of the American soldiers began to build. The first contingent of American troops arrived in Cavite on June 30th, the second under General Francis Greene on July 17th, and the third under General Arthur MacArthur Jr. on July 30th. By then, around 12,000 US troops had landed in the Philippines. As they slowly prepared to drive the Spaniards out of Manila, Aguinaldo then presented surrender terms to the Spanish Governor-General of the Philippines, Basilio Agustin, which were at first rejected. But when it became clear there was no other option, Agustin continued to negotiate a surrender with Aguinaldo. However, the Spanish Parliament all the way back in Europe discovered these negotiations were happening, and basically they were furious. In turn, Agustin was relieved and later on was replaced by Fermin Juandenes. In turn, Juandenes reached out to the American Commodore Dewey through the assistance of Belgian consulate Edouard Andre, where they began to negotiate a plan to stage the battle. This leads us to the main reasons why both the Americans and the Spanish side had a backdoor deal to stage the mock battle. The Spanish essentially didn't want to surrender to the Filipinos and saw that it was basically more honorable to surrender to the Americans so that they wouldn't look weak as they went out the door. The other was that the Americans wanted to establish their own government to rule the country and, of course, extract its natural resources. Which is why they didn't recognize the Filipinos' proclamation of independence on June 12, 1898, which is now the modern date we Filipinos celebrate our Independence Day. Going back to the scene, we then end up seeing one of the inaccuracies of the film. The film depicts the surrender of Manila to the Americans and the first ever shot of the Philippine-American War happening on the same day, while also waiting for the Treaty of Paris of 1898 to be signed, again, all on the same day.
Hintayin na lang nating matapos ang Treaty of Paris.
May delegado ba tayo sa Paris?
Which, obviously, was not the case, because the treaty wouldn't be signed until December 18th, 1898. As for the very first shot that was fired, it wouldn't even happen on the same year. Instead, it happened on February 4th, 1899. It's understandable why the filmmakers decided to take this approach, however, so that, it could condense as many historical events without dragging the movie on for far too long. Now, I actually want to talk about the first ever shot that was fired, which initiated the Philippine-American War, just because of just how well documented it is. American soldier Private William W. Grayson of the 1st Nebraska Volunteer Infantry awoke and proceeded to his usual patrol duties around 8 o'clock in the morning. As Grayson retold his story to the Omaha Daily Bee on August 6, 1899, half an hour later, Our lieutenant and sergeant of the guard were reconnoitering along our line when several Filipinos, with a lieutenant, followed and called for a halt. They approached and began proclaiming that that was their territory. Our officers pretended not to understand their lingo and soon went on their way. I was relieved at 10 o'clock and rested until 2 o'clock. That night, about 8 o'clock, Colonel John Miller Stutzenberg and I, there were two of us, were cautiously pacing our district. We came to a fence and were trying to see what the Filipinos were up to. Suddenly, near at hand on our left, there was a low but unmistakable Filipino outpost signal whistle. It was immediately answered to a similar whistle about 25 yards to the right. Then, the red lantern flashed its signal from Blockhouse 7. In a moment, something rose slowly up, not 20 feet in front of us. It was a Filipino. They were evidently moving dangerously near. I yelled, "Halt!" The man moved. I challenged him with another halt. Then he impudently shouted, "Halto!" at me. Well, I thought the best thing to do was to shoot him. He dropped. Then two Filipinos sprang out of the gateway about 15 feet from us. I called halt, and Miller fired and dropped one. I saw that another was left. Well, I think I got my second Filipino that time. Today, a historical marker was installed that commemorates the first ever shot that was fired, which started the Philippine-American War. With the cabinet meeting done, Aguinaldo gave Heneral Luna the orders to engage the Americans, transitioning to the very first battle scene in the movie. This was the Battle of Santo Tomas, which took place on May 4th, 1899. Much like how it is in real history, the Philippine Army was severely outgunned by the American forces, led by General Arthur MacArthur Jr. Their objective was to fully capture the city of San Fernando, the capital city of Pampanga province. Though not portrayed in the film for the sake of saving time, prior to the Battle of Santo Tomas, the Americans had already defeated the Filipinos in several other prior battles before this one. The biggest blow they dealt by this point was the capture of Malolos. Historically, Malolos was the site where the Constitution of the First Philippine Republic was ratified, and was the country's capital at the time. In terms of strategic advantage, it gave the Americans the opportunity to push their supply line further along the Manila-Dagupan Railway. The railway itself fell into American hands in the aftermath of the First and Second Battles of Caloocan on February 10th and February 22nd and to 25th, 1899, respectively. The other big defeat the Filipino army suffered was the Battle of Kalumpit. This saw the Americans taking control of both the Bagbag and Pampanga rivers, which held strategic bridges, with the Bagbag Bridge specifically having a railway spanning across it. During this particular battle, Aguinaldo ordered Luna to destroy the railway bridge, but this was ignored, which we'll explain much later in the video. This led to another Filipino general taking on the task instead, Gregorio del Pilar, famously known as Goyo. However, the Americans were able to repair the bridge later on and defeat the Philippine army. This opened the way for them to cross the Kalumpit-Apalit defense line, which now leads us back to the Battle of Santo Tomas. The trench or defense line that the Filipino soldiers were holding in this particular battle was the Angeles Magalag line, which was Luna's last line of defense he constructed. The first two broke after the two battles of Caloocan and the Battle of Kalumpit. Now, in the movie, Luna requested one of his men to get reinforcements. He mentions the Kawit Brigade, that was under the command of Captain Pedro Juanolino. Though it should be corrected that it should be battalion, not brigade. Unless I'm the one mistaking on this part, so my apologies in advance. But from this point onwards, in this particular video, I'm going to be referring to them as the Kawit Battalion and not the Kawit Brigade. And if that's wrong on my part, then I'm sorry. Once Luna arrives at the battalion's post, he sees the men simply hanging about, playing cards, or doing whatever besides doing proper soldier things. Obviously, Luna was rightfully infuriated, which led him to strip them of their ranks and heads over to confront Captain Juanolino. When he finally does, after waking him up from sleeping with some girl, which I'm pretty sure is a fictional addition to the film, his accompanying officer threatens the use of Article 1, or Articulo Uno, which was real. Articulo Uno was proclaimed back on March 1899, which was to instill further discipline within the military. Articulo Uno basically says whoever aids the enemy, those who rob from the army, and those who violate women would be executed without trial. Now, in the movie, the usage of Article 1 was heavily exaggerated, obviously, since it doesn't specifically mention anything about insubordination. But it could be possible in the end. Besides that, this is where it gets more inaccurate, because during the Battle of Santo Tomas, the Kawit Battalion wasn't really there, nor was Captain Juanolino, because they were already dismissed after the Second Battle of Caloocan way back in February 1899. Also, I wouldn't say Luna's actions of humiliating Juanolino and the Kawit soldiers were like how it was in the movie. Though what I can say is true is that Luna gave them an earful, since he was known for his temper. But that will be explained later on in the video. Once they headed back into the battle, it was looking more and more dire for the Filipinos. Seeing no other choice, Luna mounted his horse and charged straight forward. And much like how it played out in real history, Luna ended up getting shot off his horse, and believing he was about to die, he was about to turn his own pistol on himself, but was stopped by Alejandro Agoncillo. The difference is that the two took behind cover that was in the middle of the field, but in real life, they actually went back to the rear within their own lines. Other than that, what saved Luna from being killed was relatively the same. When he realized that his wound wasn't fatal and wasn't too deep, he saw that a bunch of coins took the majority of the bullets' impact. The difference was that the coins were gold and not silver. The other was that instead of a pouch, it was a silk belt that Luna's family gave to him. Now, the way that the battle ended in the movie wasn't exactly how it happened in real history, because the Americans continued to press on their attack and did not retreat at all. They just eventually wore the Filipinos out and defeated them much later on. But seeing the Philippines lose immediately in the first battle in a Filipino movie wouldn't really look great. So there's that. Plus, it is established later on that the Philippine army would eventually lose the battle.
Hindi tayo nanalo pa ako.
Alam ko, Heneral.
In the aftermath of the battle, we see the Americans in their encampment with Major General Elwell Otis. By this point in his military career, Otis was a seasoned soldier. His first major position was being captain of the 140th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment during the American Civil War. Then, in the Indian Wars, he was appointed as a colonel before becoming a brigadier general, and then Finally, on May 4th, 1898, he was appointed to his current rank in the movie, a major general during the Philippine-American War. In the next scene, we see Captain Juanolino and his commanding general Tomas Mascardo reporting the humiliating incident that happened with the Kawit Battalion and Luna to Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo's expression and decision to reinstate their ranks come from a personal connection that he has to not just Kawit, but the entirety of the Cavite province itself, which is where the city of Kawit is located. Many of the revolutionary members from Cavite are extraordinarily loyal to him, and members of its top brass were his closest peers and colleagues. Of course, there are other and much deeper reasons, but that will be for another time. This is just the bare bones explanation, basically saying that Aguinaldo basically just relies on the hardline loyalty of the revolutionaries and the Republican men, specifically from Cavite. Now, despite Aguinaldo's distaste for Luna's actions, Mabini pushes him to provide further support to Luna, because he was one of the very few generals who instilled discipline within the army, whilst being the only general who read and studied military theories in Europe during his time studying in Spain. We then get back to the interview between Luna and Joven. Now, like I said, Joven is a fictional character, so this interaction never happened. Much like how this small encounter that happened in Maloban that took place in the movie also didn't happen. I mean, come on, it's better to just shoot the officer than shoot the glasses and the oil lamps. I mean, I get it. It's to intimidate and to ensure the Americans won't use the house or the Bahay Kubo, as we call it in Tagalog or here in the Philippines, as an outpost in the future, but still, come on. If you're already this close, take out a strategic target. The reason for this scene? It's mainly to serve as a way for the film to establish the Luna sharpshooters. Now, just to gloss over for the sake of summarizing, the Luna sharpshooters, they were an elite unit formed by Luna to serve under the Philippine Republican Army. They became famous for fighting more fiercely than the regular Filipino army soldiers. Most of the members of this unit came from the old Spanish army, which fought during the Philippine Revolution. Now, we then cut away to the first direct reference to the Luna defense line. This was a multi-tiered defense that was made up of several trenches and other fortifications. The tactic was that the initial lines of the defense would act as a delay to the American advance, with the last lines being the most fortified. The last defenses of the Luna defense line would mostly be located further up north in the mountains of Luzon, where the terrain would favor the Filipinos. Of course, the issue with this is that it takes a lot of manpower to build these trenches and fortifications, which is why the movie shows Luna and his accompanying officers gathering more people to not only help construct the defense lines, but also to gather more soldiers under his control. Of course, in real history, it didn't exactly happen how it did in the movie.
Pag di daw po kami sumama sa kanya, papatayin daw niya kaming lahat.
We also see Luna and his officers sequestering a train to be used for the Philippine Army. The word sequestering is just a fancy word for temporary confiscation, by the way. Now, I tried my best to see if he ever arrested a poor British guy who was there on business relations with the Secretary of State, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to find anything similar to what happened. Nor was I able to find any instance of Luna beating out the family members of his officers off the train that was meant to transport his men and ammunition to Bataan. What all of this is meant to show is the main narrative of the movie, that the much bigger threat to the Filipinos in this war against the Americans is themselves.
Kaya nating magbuwis ng buhay para sa pamilya, pero sa isang prinsipyong makabayan.
After that, the movie plays out the battles and other events that happened so far up until this point, which are being retrospectively looked back upon for Hovens's interview. As Luna rides back home, he and his officer, Captain Eduardo Rusca, gossip about Luna's family. Rusca gave some news that some drunk men made a scene in town, with one of them being Antonio Luna's brother, Joaquin, who was his second oldest brother after Juan. Now, I can't say for sure if there has been an incident similar to what was said in the movie, but this part,
Alam mo bang munting na kaming magkabarilan ni Dr. Rizal dahil sa babae?
this I can say with confidence is true. Funnily enough, we even know who the woman was. I do wish for you guys to listen with glee because this story is quite a fun one. The woman that the movie is referring to is Nelly Busted, a half French, half Filipino daughter of a wealthy European businessman, with her family, close friends, and other acquaintances calling her Nelly. During Dr. Jose Rizal's time of traveling across Europe for his studies, the Busted family hosted his stay in their villa residence in Villa Elida in Biarritz, France, in February 1891. Also, I am very, very sorry if I butchered the French name there, okay? Rizal was already quite acquainted with the Busted family, having befriended them all the way back in 1889 to 1890, where he would fence with both Nelly and her sister, usually inside of Juan Lunas' art studio in Paris. And it was during this time that Antonio Luna was an active scientific researcher during his stay in France, and was frequently visiting the Busted family. And considering the close proximity, naturally, he would end up courting Nelly. And as we say nowadays, this is where we get to the tea. Now, Luna would actually be successful in his courtship of Nelly, but as more time passed, they slowly began to drift further away from each other. And also around this same time, between 1889 and 1891, Nelly started to become more infatuated with Jose Rizal. It was then, during a party that was held by Filipinos in Madrid, that a drunken Antonio Luna uttered unsavory remarks against Nelly. Obviously, we can't really say what he said, nor do I wish to know, but we can assume that it was the 1800s' version of "you're disloyal," just to not use any words that are also unsavory in our modern time. But this made Rizal react to defend her, which led to him challenging Luna to a duel. But thankfully, Luna ended up apologizing to Rizal later on, thus averting a duel between the two compatriots. In a letter that was sent by Luna to him, he expressed his apology by saying, "With respect to Nelly, frankly, I think there is nothing between us more than one of those friendships enlivened by being fellow countrymen. It seems to me that there is nothing more. My word of honor. I had been her fiancé. We wrote to each other. I like her because I knew how worthy she was. But circumstances beyond our control made all that happiness one cherished evaporate. She is good. She is naturally endowed with qualities admirable in a young woman, and I believe that she will bring happiness not only to you, but to any other man who is worthy of her. I congratulate you as one congratulates a friend. Congratulations. Now, I should say, however, if, if, if the duel proceeded, I had, I have a feeling that Luna would have won. Because when both Rizal, the Lunas, and other educated Filipinos who were staying over in Europe, all of them had basically said that Antonio Luna was considered one of the best swordsmen. So, with that in mind, it would have been a funny scene to watch seeing both of these men go at it. Anyways, back to the movie. We see a touching scene between Luna and his supposed lover named Isabel. However, Isabel is another fictional character made for the movie. She's basically a composited character that's based on Luna's many love interests. So the scene between them is fictional, though admittedly it is quite sweet. This then jumps forward to another meeting in Aguinaldo's cabinet, where we're introduced to the Secretary of Public Development, Felipe Buencamino. Buencamino then brings up the offer of the Philippines becoming an American protectorate via the Sherman Commission. The Sherman Commission was created by the United States President William McKinley on January 20th, 1899. It was tasked to study the situation in the Philippines and make recommendations on how it could proceed after the sovereignty of the Philippines was ceded to the United States. Along with Buencamino, the other cabinet member who voiced his opinion for the end of the war was Pedro Paterno. And in the film, it says that Paterno's position was the head of the cabinet. It's basically the movie's way of saying that he's the executive secretary. At least from my interpretation, so it could mean entirely something else, since the system of government of the First Republic of the Philippines is vastly different from the current one. Anyways, back to the Sherman Commission. The commission essentially concluded in its final report that if the United States were to withdraw all operations, the Philippines would fall into anarchy, and that only through American occupation the country would be able to remain stable. This ended up pissing Luna off, obviously, as well as the hardline members who wished to remain fully independent. Now, the movie doesn't show the passage of time quite well, but it is by this point that the war has raged for several months by this point. Hence the reason why Paterno said that they are running out of supplies and arms and ammunition and all that. Now, Luna ends up calling him a coward and a traitor, because despite the odds tilting against him heavily, he's still willing to fight against the Americans. Now, there's an interesting piece of dialogue where Buencamino name-dropped Dr. Jose Rizal's name.
Kahit si Dr. Jose Rizal.
Nasisikmura ba ng gabinete ang ganitong kataksilan?
Seemingly, this just seems like a nothing burger and just a throwaway line for the movie. But this is a very subtle reference that the movie made to an opinion that Rizal had in his past. Initially, Rizal wasn't a full hardline advocate for independence. And as I explained at the beginning of this video, the organizations La Solidaridad and La Liga Filipina, both of these pushed for reforms that would have instead granted rights to Filipinos equal to those of the Spanish. Because in Rizal's view, at least by this point in his life, the Philippines wasn't ready for independence. And since Buencamino got cut off by Luna, we weren't able to hear this potential bomb. However, it is understandable that it may not serve much for the movie, and it may even tarnish the national hero image of Jose Rizal itself. The confrontation then began to escalate to the point where Luna slapped Buencaminos' face after he mentioned his brother Juan for killing his wife. The two started to throw hands, but Aguinaldo was able to order the fight to be broken up. Afterwards, Luna ordered the arrest of both Buencamino and Paterno, which Mabini says is within his authority. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any source of this ever happening, nor have I found claims of Buencamino bringing up Juan Luna's name. Though I do want to touch up on the mention of Juan Luna murdering his wife. Even if Buencamino never said it in real life, what was referenced in the movie was true. Back in 1886, 29-year-old Juan Luna was married to Maria de la Paz Pardo de Tavera. For the first few years of their marriage, they lived happily together in Paris and gave birth to their son, Andres. After 4 years, however, things started to fall apart. Juan began to suspect that Maria was having an affair with another man. It was then, on September 22nd, 1892, Maria's two brothers and her mother, Doña Juliana, came to visit them and her son, who was sick at the time. Both brothers then went out shortly to have breakfast at a nearby cafe. Both Maria and her mother then decided to follow afterwards. But as they went downstairs, they saw Juan Luna holding a gun. He then fired multiple shots at them, but they hurried back upstairs and locked themselves in the bathroom. Meanwhile, both of Maria's brothers, who were at the nearby cafe, heard the gunshots and hurried back to the house. Juan then also fired shots at the both of them, leaving them seriously wounded. Juan then went upstairs and eventually found both of his wife and his mother-in-law in the bathroom, and shot them both in the head. Juan would then be immediately arrested by the French authorities. But it was only the year after, in February 1893, that he was released after only spending 6 months in prison. His lawyer claimed that the killings were committed under the grounds of crime of passion. Basically, it means that if it were proven that a husband's wife was caught cheating, it gives the husband a reason to punish or even kill their own wife. This ended up giving Juan a much lighter sentence in the end. Now, even if Buencamino never said anything that alluded to this, the fight that happened between him and Luna really did happen. The problem is that there are just so many accounts and claims as to what had happened. According to Filipino historian Teodoro Agoncillo, when Luna spat his accusations at Buencamino for being a traitor and an autonomous, the latter spat back at Luna for being responsible for the loss at Calumpit, for ignoring Aguinaldo's orders to destroy the bridge that spanned across the Bagbag River. This then sent Luna into a fit of rage, lunging towards Buencamino, knocking him down, and was only broken up when Aguinaldo physically intervened. In another historical account, according to Vivencio Jose, it went a little differently. Interestingly enough, his account came from the memoirs of Buencamino's son Victor. When the slap was thrown by Luna, and the fight began to break out, instead of Aguinaldo intervening physically, he simply stood up and raised his voice to remind Luna that he was in the presence of the Philippine president. This was the version that the movie went with. But this is where things differ even more, and frustratingly so, but also hilariously so. In Aguinaldo's own book, A Second Look at America, that was published in 1957, Aguinaldo claims that Luna, quote, violently slapped Buencamino, knocking him down. he was about to attack the others as well when I stopped him. So you can tell that though this incident did really happen, how it all went down exactly is still quite divisive in some details today. But no matter what, the outcome was still the same. It then jumps forward to another outpost of the Philippine Army, and the movie introduces us to Aguinaldo's mother. It transitions to the elite essentially having a dinner party, despite the war still raging on. Though one of the attendants said out loud that he really doesn't care, so long as business stays good.
Tema, a mí no me importa que los americanos ganen la guerra o no, con tal de que vaya bien para el negocio.
It then moves to a meeting between Aguinaldo, Tomas Mascardo, and Apolinario Mabini. They were discussing the number of men that would fall under Aguinaldo's direct command, and Mascardo mentions a lieutenant named Manuel Quezon. Yes, this is the Manuel Quezon, future president of the Philippine Commonwealth. In this scene, the movie shows the controversial killing of the founder of the Katipunan and the Philippine Revolution, Andres Bonifacio, and his brother. We'll get back to this by the end of the video after the movie review. We then find ourselves back on the battlefield outpost where Luna explains the purpose of the Luna defense line, as well as the possible tactics that could make it effective against the Americans. The problem now is the need for more men. This led to Luna requesting Mascardo to send his men for reinforcements. The problem was that Mascardo kept refusing Luna's orders and simply stayed where he was stationed in Arayat. The reason that was given was that he was inspecting troops. This is what the back and forth was based on in the movie. Now, as good as this scene was, there is a problem here, and it mainly has to do with the timeline. When Luna finally confronted Mascardo in Arayat, this would happen during the Battle of Kalumpit. And if the first battle was the Battle of Santo Tomas, which happened on May 1899, then we've basically gone backwards in time, since Mascardo was detained by Luna, which happened in April 1899, a month earlier. So, in reality, these two scenes in the movie, if we were to follow real history, should switch. Not really sure why the movie pursued it in this order. The only plausible explanation for this would be that it would flow a bit nicer for the movie. But even that, I'm not so sure about. But at this point, we are introduced to General Gregorio de Pilar, who would be the main protagonist of the movie's sequel, Goyo, the Boy General. And as it played out in real history, due to Luna's absence going to Guagua to detain Mascardo, in the end, it would be Goyo and his troops to hold the position. Even with Luna's return to reinforce his men, the Americans would eventually drive them out of their positions and defeat the Philippine army. It then moves forward to Aguinaldo's new headquarters, located in Nueva Ecija, situated in central Luzon. We see him, Mascardo, Mabini, and the two cabinet members Luna arrested in the movie, Paterno and Buencamino. Luna then ended up arriving to submit his resignation to the president. His reason for wanting to step away is due to his mounting frustrations on how the war was turning out, which weren't looking so good by this point. Now, in the movie, Aguinaldo ended up refusing to accept his resignation, with him and Mabini saying he's the only capable general to lead the army. In real history, however, Aguinaldo actually ended up accepting the resignation, and Luna ended up resigning on March 1st, 1899. This is another problem with the movie's timeline, but with this one, I'm willing to just let it slide. However, Luna's retirement didn't really last long, as he went back to Aguinaldo to reinstate him as general after the Philippine army suffered another defeat in the Battle of Marilao River on March 27th, 1899. Only this time, Aguinaldo promoted him to the rank of lieutenant general. In the movie, Luna pushed Aguinaldo to support the development of the Luna defense line, putting emphasis on building a fortress up in the northern provinces. Tactically, the fortress that would be located in the north, where the majority of the terrain is mountainous, would serve as the sort of last stand position for the Philippine army, where the Americans would have a natural disadvantage. Unfortunately, this wouldn't come to fruition, both in history and in the movie. With that, we cut to Luna in his headquarters where he'd get some relaxation, which was later interrupted by his mother, Lorena Novicio Anchenta. Seeing her child looking ragged, rightfully so, she then helps him relax by having him recall his past before he became a military general. In the flashbacks, we see the full Luna family, from both Juan's and Antonio's time in Europe to study, and also the founding of La Independencia. We then also see the only time in this film Dr. Jose Rizal and his eventual execution by the Spaniards. As his execution plays out, we hear the final part of Rizal's final poem, Mi Ultimo Adios, or My Last Goodbye. The poem itself didn't have any corrections at all, and was Rizal's final piece before his execution, which he wrote as he waited inside his jail cell. His execution and his final poem are widely seen as his full-fledged sacrifice for his country that he wishes to see free from its oppressors. After that, we then see Luna having a duel, which, as I said in this video earlier, he was acclaimed as the best Filipino swordsman. His mother told him that he could have had a peaceful life, and that he's a skilled doctor, which is true. As I said before, Luna was an active scientific researcher. Not only that, he was an accomplished pharmacist, contributing to the study of tropical and communicable diseases. As the sweet moment between Luna and his mother continued, we see snippets of a telegram from President Aguinaldo. It's later revealed that it was for Luna, which was sent to him on June 2nd, 1892, ordering him to head over to Cabanatuan to discuss forming a new cabinet, though something feels off. As Luna departs, Aguinaldo seems to be leaving his headquarters in Cabanatuan with his own dispatch of the army, which is under the command of General Gregorio de Pilar. His story would later be told in the movie's sequel. Not only that, but we also get to see Lieutenant Manuel Quezon, who, after exchanging greetings with Aguinaldo, looks a little confused that the president's own personal guard, which by this point was the Kawit Battalion, was staying behind. And what's fun is that even if the appearance of Quezon was extremely brief, he would be the central character of the third movie of the Bayaniverse. Going back to Luna, when he finally arrived at Cabanatuan on the 5th of June, he only had two of his officers with him, Captain Eduardo Rusca and Colonel Francisco Roman. As he walked through towards the president's office, instead of finding Aguinaldo, he found Buencamino instead sitting at the desk. He tells Luna that Aguinaldo had already left Cabanatuan. After a short but heated argument, he stormed out of the office after he heard a shot being fired at the Plaza Lucero. It was here that Luna's fate was sealed in tragedy. When Luna confronted the guards, who were part of the Kawit Battalion, He also encountered Captain Juanolino. Suddenly, Luna was attacked by the guards. Despite getting slashed by the soldiers' bolo knives and getting shot at point-blank range, Luna still tried to fight back. Meanwhile, both Ruska and Roman heard the commotion and tried to reach Luna to aid him. But other members of the Kawit battalion stopped them and ended up killing Roman. And it was only after suffering 30 to 40 wounds, General Antonio Luna would finally fall after his body couldn't take much more from his attackers. Though his assassination and death were heavily dramatized in the film, it is still relatively authentic in a sense because Luna suffered so many blows. Obviously, if he had been shot in the head, he would have died from the first shot he took. And in a form of great movie poetry, as both the bodies of Antonio Luna and Francisco Roman were dragged, the scene emulated Juan Luna's most popular artistic piece that gave him multiple awards and gave him the recognition of the most popular Filipino painter ever, the Spolarium. In the aftermath of Luna's death, many of Luna's soldiers and officers were removed from their posts and relieved of their services, with essentially the entire army now firmly under Aguinaldo's command. And the film ends with Joven interviewing those who were suspected of being behind Luna's assassination, that being both Buencamino and Aguinaldo. As for the Americans, both General MacArthur Jr. and Otis both said that the Philippines killed the only general they had. The movie then ends with an ending crawl explaining the end of the Philippine-American War. Despite retreating to the mountain provinces and switching over to guerrilla warfare, it only delayed the inevitable. Aguinaldo soon surrendered to the Americans on April 19th, 1901. But it was only in the year after, on July 4th, 1902, the new United States President Theodore Roosevelt declared that the war had officially ended. And that's the end of the movie. Honestly, this was a film I wanted to get into ever since I began making my own movie reviews. Obviously, despite being a small channel and having very few of these types of videos on my channel, this is something I am very proud of, since it's about my country's own very history. Now, this is where we get into the spicy stuff usually, where I go into further depth into the movie's historical topic, though instead of that, since I believe I did a good enough job explaining the main historical topic that the film mostly touches on, I will instead address some of the controversies and some other questions that I have felt that I left unanswered in this review. The first thing I want to talk about is the Luna defense line. Unfortunately, like I said, this never really garnered the needed support for it to become a reality. But when the American military observers saw the proposal, they were quite astonished by it. They described it as a series of bamboo trenches stretching from town to town. This allowed the Filipinos to withdraw gradually, firing from cover at the advancing Americans. As the American troops occupied each new position, they were subjected to a series of traps that had been set in the trenches. And with the last and its strongest part of the defense being a base located in the mountain provinces. When I was researching for this review, I started to ask myself what would have happened if the defense line itself came to fruition. It's the same question a lot of Filipino history buffs have online, but if you were to ask me, it really wouldn't have changed anything. Because even if Aguinaldo ended up retreating to the mountain provinces and began to rely on guerrilla warfare, a constructed base wouldn't make much of a difference in terms of the result. I mean, yeah, it is possible that the Americans would have much of a harder fight, but in the end, it would simply delay the inevitable a lot longer for the Philippines to essentially end up losing the war in the end, because in terms of firepower, the Philippines wouldn't really stand a chance. Now, oh boy. Now time to touch on the very controversial parts in this video. As I mentioned, the movie ended up showing us the execution of the founding father of the Katipunan and the Philippine Revolution, Andres Bonifacio. In Philippine history, the execution of Bonifacio remains an extremely controversial topic. And when this movie first came out, the narrative that was shown was that Aguinaldo was directly responsible for the execution of Bonifacio, which unfortunately is true. After the Teodoro Convention on March 22nd, 1897, where different factions of the Katipunan assembled in Cavite to formally form a revolutionary government, Bonifacio felt that he was cheated during the convention's pseudo-elections. He felt that, as the founding father of the Katipunan, he should hold the position of president, but it ended up going to Aguinaldo instead, who, by the way, wasn't even there during the convention. There were mentions of automatically giving the position of vice president to Bonifacio, but they elected Mariano Trias instead. It was at this point that Bonifacio was elected as the director of the interior, but opposing members to this spoke up and said that Bonifacio wasn't fit for a high position because he never had a high level of formal education. This outraged Bonifacio, who drew his pistol on those who disagreed with him before he was calmed down. In the aftermath of the convention, several members forwarded complaints to Aguinaldo. This eventually led to Bonifacio's arrest and eventual execution on May 10th, 1897. This topic still heavily divides people to this day, much like how the assassination of Antonio Luna is as well. When it comes to the killing of Luna, this one is a lot more divisive. All the American newspapers at that time published that Aguinaldo was responsible, but Joaquin, Antonio Luna's brother, believed that the reason for his brother's killing was simply because the soldiers of the Kawit Battalion just didn't like him. To me, personally, this part seems way too simple, but it is no secret that Captain Juanolino and other members of the Kawit Battalion weren't so fond of him, at least to put it very lightly. Another reason for people's differing opinions was due to the fact that the telegrams that were sent to Luna were initially missing. It was this reason that Filipino historian Teodoro Agoncillo wrote in his book, Malolos, The Crisis of the Republic, that Aguinaldo wasn't directly responsible for his death. However, very recently, back in 2018, an original telegram was discovered which possibly contained a reply that Luna was en route to Cabanatuan. But when the telegram was later translated, Luna's reply didn't contain any word that he was on his way, or a discussion on a possible new cabinet being assembled. Instead, his reply at the bottom of the message was, Felipe Buen Camino, not yet detained based on my accusation, with the top of it being the initial message reading, paging for an important meeting. Therefore, you are ordered to come here immediately, waiting for a reply to my previous telegram about urgent matters to discuss. It is really an emergency. Now, unfortunately, we can't really say for sure what these urgent matters were, nor do we know anything about the previous telegrams, since people have come to the conclusion that they must have been lost to history. However, there is another interesting part to this, and it has to do with this scene in particular from the movie.
Ano? Nagalaw pa ba yan?
Now, it just seems like a throwaway line. Maybe to even act as a grim gag reaction to Luna's killing in the movie. However, according to the book The Rise and Fall of Antonio Luna by Vivencio Jose, eyewitnesses to the assassination included a recollection of an old woman looking out a window. Though there have been contradicting accounts to what might have been said by her. We'll get to that in a bit. So, what the scene is meant to represent is the possibility of who might have instigated Antonio Luna's killing. Another Filipino historian, Dr. Ambeth Ocampo, revealed during a history festival that it was possibly Aguinaldo's mother, Trinidad Fami de Aguinaldo, who killed Luna. Now, before everyone starts throwing this out and just rage in the comments, Ocampo's argument is quite interesting. That it might actually be true. The evidence that he presented from a short documentary done by GMA, Ocampo points to the findings of Juan Villamor, the author responsible for writing the first biographies of Antonio Luna. Specifically, he points to Villamor's work titled La Tragedia de Cabanatuan. In the book, as you read through it, one footnote from it says this: induced by dominant advisors, especially by a woman whose affections he could not disregard. Now, going back to Vivencio Jose's book, one of the accounts he wrote was the possibility of the old woman who was looking out the window being Trinidad Fami, who said what was said in the movie.
Ano? Nagalaw pa ba yan?
However, Jose said that it could possibly be another woman altogether who was present in the church during the time. And according to some accounts, this old woman shouted from the window, "Why did you kill the general? Don't you recognize him? You are all bad men." With all of this in mind, Ocampo supports his claim that the old woman was Trinidad Fami, because at this point she was still staying in Cabanatuan, and some eyewitnesses even said that it is a possibility that she was there when the assassination of Luna took place. One important thing to mention, the relationship between Aguinaldo and his mother was really close. Throughout the war, both of them stayed close together, and Aguinaldo went out of his way to make sure that they wouldn't get separated. Ocampo ended up answering the question of why Aguinaldo made sure that his mother would be with him at all times.
Kailangan kasama niya yung nanay niya dahil kung nakuha ng kalaban yung nanay mo, iho-hostage siya para sumuko yung anak.
Another factor to consider here, considering how inseparable both the mother and the child were, Aguinaldo would have probably leaned over towards his mother's shoulders for potential advice. Maybe even vice versa, where Trinidad Fami might have given advice over her son's shoulders. Because during the time of the war, he was barely entering his 30s, and in the movie, we see him leaning over towards Mabini many times. So you can kind of get the impression that he was impressionable to a certain degree. But the question here is whether it was Trinidad Fami's maternal influence that could have instigated Luna's assassination. What was her motive, if it was true? Well, according to Dr. Ocampo, he once again references Juan Villamor.
It's excessive maternal protection.
As he further explains, the close inner circle of Aguinaldo, specifically Trinidad Fami, his mother, and Felipe Buencamino, might have thought of the possibility of Luna replacing him due to Luna's strict and tough-line actions to keep morale high and to keep the military in line. Of course, with this portrayal of Aguinaldo and also Ocampo's research and claims, a lot of people got mad, like a lot of people. Most especially Aguinaldo's descendant,
Nakaka-frustrate yun. You have to consider yung mga history professors na may kanya-kanyang interpretasyon.
Now, as much as I laugh and rightfully feel a bit frustrated with all of these kinds of reactions, there is a bit of a bright side to it. And it's the fact that people are talking about history. Admittedly, Dr. Ocampo could have worded himself a little bit better, but when it comes to comments that are made to discredit him, his profession, or maybe even discredit the whole field, that is where I draw the line. Despite the messy inaccuracies and the negative sounding opinions from certain people, I still really enjoyed this movie. Not only was it the first full historical movie that essentially popularized the genre to a modern audience, but it was also because the movie took a unique approach in portraying the country's historical figures. And that is making them more human. Throughout this film, instead of the more stiff and the all high and mighty figures we imagined when we first studied Filipino history, the movie presents us a relatively more grounded approach. Luna's temper, though heavily dramatized, admittedly, is as authentic as it can get to the real figure. And when it comes to Aguinaldo, the actor who plays him, Mon Confiado, said that his method was to portray the first Philippine Republic's president was to make him, again, make him feel more human.
Tapos kung mag-aasta ako sa bahay namin, general, presidente, pero ayoko siyang maging parang naninigas eh. Nakaganon, nakaslouch, problematic.
Personally, for me, this trait of portraying those historical figures is what made this film shine, and would be a common trait across the next two preceding films of the Bayaniverse. And the best part about all of it, as I said before, it gave the genre a new lease of life. And it got everyone to speak about my country's history. And in my opinion, it gets us thinking about our historical figures in the best unique way possible. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next movie review, and that's gonna be Goyo.